Students, in the last session, we have learnt the dynamics of sex structure, and we also learnt that dynamics of sex structure is influenced by three important factors. The first one, the fertility, which is, we say it is the sex ratio at birth. The second is the mortality or death, which is the sex differentials in mortality, and the final one, the third one, is the migration, which is sex differentials in migration. Let us now learn more on the sex ratio at birth, because we have also learned that while the sex ratio at birth in the past has been primarily determined by the biological factors, with a relatively higher number of males are born compared to females, but within a safe range of 104 males to 108 males for every 100 females. This may not necessarily be true now because of the advancement in technology and sex selective abortions. So, to understand more on this and to understand more on the pattern which we observe in India sex ratio at birth, we will look more closely into sex ratio at birth, both in terms of its understanding and also both in terms of its patterns within the country. So, we have already defined what is sex ratio at birth. It is simply the ratio of male birth to female birth in a population. So, sex ratio is either represented as sex ratio of males to females or ratio of females to males. There are two ways of defining sex ratio. The sex ratio at birth is usually in international level is defined as the number of male births for every 100 female births, but in India it is also defined in terms of number of female births for every 1000 male births. Let us see first the type of sex ratio. First, we have seen the primary sex ratio and secondary sex ratio and the tertiary sex ratio. What is primary sex ratio? Primary sex ratio is defined as the ratio between males and females at the time of conception. It is important to note that at the time of conception, there are much more male are conceived compared to females, meaning from the conception onwards, the chances of survival for the males are much lower than the female conception. Therefore, the chances of abortions and the chances of miscarriage, the chances of other related incidents can be higher for the male conceived birth compared to a female conceived birth. The secondary sex ratio is the ratio between male and female at the time of birth, which is sex ratio at birth. Birth normally we define as the live births. There can be instances where there are the stillbirths or there are advanced stages of mortality at the womb itself. In this case also, it is often believed that male has higher chances of mortality or having higher chances of stillbirth compared to the female birth. The tertiary sex ratio, which is the ratio between males and females at the time of enumeration. Normally, we would imagine that the tertiary sex ratio represents the real sex ratio, but even in this situation, in this case, it is often found that there are sex selective under-enumeration in many instances. That means the female births of female are many often undercounted compared to or under-enumerated compared to males in many populations due to various cultural and other reasons. The sex ratio at birth as represented by the females births born to every 100 males in India, while it is, as already pointed out, it is represented as the number of males born to every 100 girls in other parts of the world. If sex ratio is represented by male divided by female in 100, usually there are 103 to 108 boys are born compared to 100 females. In India, if you look at, there are huge difference between a normal sex ratio, which is 103 to 108 males for every 100 females. In 2006-8, for instance, the observed sex ratio at birth in India was around 111, while internationally the normal sex ratio was in the range of 105 boys for every 100 girls. So, it really represents that in India the sex ratio is not simply biologically determined. There are many other forces which plays an important role in sex ratio at birth in India. In the older years or in the past, the couples were not left with much options in determining the sex of the fetus. Therefore, the sex ratio at birth normally would be anticipated as the normal sex ratio or the biologically determined sex ratio. It is also true that in a very high fertility situation, when the couples have a large number of children, the large family to achieve a desired number of sons is much easier than when you have a smaller number of children. Therefore, in such situation, when the fertility rate has been higher or the number of births has been higher for couples, the sex ratio is often expected to be normal, because the couples invariably have the desired number of sons they wanted compared to a situation where the birth rate is low and they are expect to have a certain number of male births within the family. But with the sex determination test easily available in many parts of the country, a small family became a norm. The desired number of children with a particular sex composition also gone up, resulting in worsening sex ratio in many contexts. India is classical examples, but we have also many other countries in the Asian region where sex ratio has been much more favorable to males compared to females, particularly the sex ratio at birth. Let us come back to India and look at India more closely to understand sex ratio at birth. One of the serious issues which face to understand sex ratio in India is the data systems available to estimate sex ratio at birth. Perhaps we can say there are 4 major sources of data available to estimate sex ratio at birth, but each of it has its own serious limitations. In many countries of the world, the sex ratio at birth is estimated through what is generally known as Civil Registration System, CRS. What is CRS? CRS is the mandatory for everyone to register their births whenever a birth happens in a family or for a couple. So, normally many countries, as soon as the birth happens, the birth is registered. So, it is easy in those situations to estimate the birth rate or the sex ratio at birth all using the civil registration system data. However, unfortunately, in India, the civil registration system is still inadequate and registration of the birth is still incomplete. And many often it is also found that it is incomplete mostly for the female births. So, naturally, you can also see situations where registration CRS data gives you much higher incidence of sex ratio simply because many of the female births might not have got registered. The second option which was available in India was known as sample registration system. The sample registration system came into being primarily because the civil registration system in India was unable to provide a good system of registration. As a result, the government of India launched a system of sample registration unit, and the data collected from these sample areas are used for computing the sex ratio at birth. The sample registration system gives you annual series of data at the state level on the sex ratio at birth for last several years now. The sex ratio at birth can also perhaps be computed from the census data, although it has to be used a bit more carefully, because census does not give you an idea about the births, but it gives you an idea about the population. So, naturally, the births or the population has to be adjusted for the mortality if you really want to compute sex ratio at birth at different levels. It is also possible in India there are large scale surveys which captures information on the birth history, like National Family Health Survey NFHS. The NFHS survey has the information on the births which happening in the country for last several years, because it captures the birth which happened to every sampled women during their reproductive life years. So, it is possible to compute sex ratio at birth from these surveys. However, one has to keep in mind that computation of sex ratio at birth from the surveys often has a large sampling errors. Naturally, there are possibilities of confidence interval and sampling errors due to less number of events in the male and female births compared to what is expected for a real estimation of the sex ratio at birth. Let us now turn back to what are the major determinants of the sex ratio at birth. We have already seen that sex ratio at birth normally would have been determined only by the biological factors, but that is not the case in recent years. The prenatal diagnostic techniques, which is known as PNDT, which determines the sex of the baby, is one of the important determinants of the sex ratio at birth in recent years. The diagnostics of the sex ratio of the baby at the time of conception leads to sex selective abortion, which really lead to a unbiased sex ratio at birth away from the normal sex ratio. We will also see that sex ratio at birth is also determined by something called a sex of the siblings, meaning in India many couples have a desire to have a particular sex composition for their children. So, to achieve this sex composition of the children, they would also likely to go for a sex selective abortion, so that they at the end they have a desired number of children of a particular sex composition. And there are also other factors which determines sex ratio at birth. primarily antenatal care. In case there are good antenatal care services available, it is possible that the survival chances of the children are far better, or even the possibilities of abortions and miscarriages as well as the stillbirth are much lower, resulting in actually a perhaps a larger, higher sex ratio, because it is expected that the chances of survival even within the womb is much lower for the male birth compared to female birth. Similarly, the delivery type of delivery or institutional delivery also determines to some extent the sex ratio at birth. The higher survival chances of the children, all the children irrespective of the sex, also leads to a sex ratio at birth perhaps slightly higher than what would have been expected normally. But the influence of antenatal care or the type of delivery, etc., much lower than compared to the other two factors which we have discussed, like PNDT, prenatal diagnostic techniques, which leads to the identification of the sex of the fetus, leading to sex selective abortions, and the desire of the parents, desire of the couples to have a particular sex composition for their children, and resulting in the sex of the siblings. Finally, we would also see that the sex ratio at birth which we see, which is reported, is also affected by something called a misreporting of the children's, especially which we found in many contexts, especially in the context where the status of women are relatively poor. There are often female births and females are misreported compared to males. So, it is possible that the sex ratio at birth computed for any place, for any country, it is also biased primarily because of the registration or the reporting of the birth was not similar for males and females. When there is dissimilarity in the reporting between sexes, naturally we would also get a sex ratio at birth which is biased in its nature. We will again look at in India a little more closely to understand what is the trends in sex ratio at birth in the country. It is already noted that India, as compared to many other countries in the West or developed regions, has a much higher sex ratio in terms of higher number of males than females in a population. That is, the normal sex ratio range is not followed in the case of the data which is available on sex ratio in India. It is often argued that the worsening of the sex ratio at birth in India is primarily because of the easy availability of the sex determination tools in the country at a very low cost, which is affordable for many of the socioeconomic groups in the country. Not only the sex selective abortions, but there are also other factors affecting sex ratio at birth, like we have told differentials in mortality, low fertility and stillbirth rate, etc. If you look at the sex ratio at birth over the last 10 years or so, when there has been a large concern on the worsening sex ratio in the country, you would see that the sex ratio at birth has invariably always been much lower than what is expected, as India computes sex ratio in terms of females divided by males for every 1000 males. The sex ratio at birth around the early part of the last decades was even below 900 in India, meaning it is expected that India to have for a normal sex ratio around 952 females are born for every 1000 males, but you can see that it has been always been invariably, it has been much lower than the normal expected sex ratio at birth. Therefore, it is anticipated, it is expected that the sex ratio at birth in India is not normal, is not biologically determined, but it has been the result of many other factors, particularly the sex selective abortions. We would also see a very significant regional variation in sex ratio at birth across states in India. There are pockets of discrimination against females if you look at the sex composition of the population, and particularly the sex ratio at birth of the population. The sex ratio at birth has been very significantly lower in some parts of the country, particularly in the pockets of Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, where the patriarchal norm has been very prevalent compared to other parts of the country. So, you would see that the sex ratio at birth has been even much lower than the 900 mark in many of these places compared to the other parts of the country. Although in general in India, it has been always been lower than the anticipated 952 mark. While over the period some states observed improvement, undoubtedly, there are still large pockets of concerns in the country. You would see from the table that there are different regions, different states where there has been slight improvement over the last decade, but there are also cases of worsening in the sex ratio at birth. In general, we would see the sex ratio at birth patterns in the country really show sometimes some alarming pattern of very low sex ratio at birth in certain contexts. Also, there are some positive signs of improvement for the last 10 years or so in some parts, but in general, we will see that it has been much lower than the normal sex ratio, which indicates that the discrimination against females, the discrimination against female births are still very prevalent in many parts of the country. This is despite the fact that the government has taken several initiatives to avoid sex selective abortions through several measures and policies. Let us also come back to a discussion on what are its implications. What are the major implications for the sex ratio imbalance in case there are deliberate sex ratio imbalance in the sex ratio at birth? We will primarily classify the implications into three categories. Firstly, there are serious social implications. Secondly, there are demographic implications, and also one would say there are major economic implications. Socially, a imbalance in the sex ratio depicts that in future you would have much less number of females in the society compared to the males. It has very wider implications in terms of marriage, in terms of balance of sexes within the family, balance of sexes in the society, as well as a larger implications for the marriage pattern, for the type of sexual orientations, etc., as well as on the harmony between sexes. It is often found that violence against women, protectionist tendency against women, all becomes much higher when there are very skewed sex ratio in a population. Similarly, there are also large demographic implications of the sex ratio at birth. A lower sex ratio implies that there are less number of women in the society, and less number of women in the society implies that in each of the age group there is imbalance which has a potential impact on various social and economic aspects. It also shows that not only in the context of marriage, but also in the societal living, it also reflects the overall functioning within the family. There will be a major imbalance which is created, which can affect the family orientation, the family composition, and the household structure, division in the family life, and so on and so forth. Finally, the economic implications are supposed to be a very significant part of the sex ratio imbalance. In a demographic dividend framework, if you analyze, it is expected that with the changes in the demographic transition, with the changes in the age structure transition, it is expected that females increasingly enter into labor force, because females are more now devoid of work in their childbearing and child rearing responsibilities because of the lower fertility, which would really enhance the capacity to increase the economic well-being or economic growth of a particular region, of a particular country. But in the absence of number of females in a society, the female's contribution to the economy might significantly be less than what is anticipated in a demographic transition framework. Therefore, it is possible that the economy as a whole is also affected by considerable imbalance which is created between the sexes in any society or a nation. It is true that both the society, the policy makers, and others are aware of what is happening in the sex ratio situation in the country. As early as in the 1970s, with the introduction of amniocentesis test for the sex determination, there has been large concern on sex determination of the fetus and using sex selective abortions in the country. So, government has even framed a law as early as in 1976 banning sex determination as part of the amniocentesis test. But despite the banning through a law, it was often argued that the test widely continued and sex selective abortions are widely carried out in the country and many parts of the country. And later, government has came out with another act on PNDT Act, which is pre-conception and prenatal diagnostic techniques, banning any sex determination as part of this test. This was enacted in 1994 and amended, effectively implemented in 2003 and strictly amended again in 2011. At this juncture, there has been strict rules through these laws in registration of any units which is doing prenatal diagnostic test, and also making sure that all the data are made available both to the government as well as to the concerned agencies. With all these regulations and policies framework in position, it is still found that the sex ratio imbalance at birth continues to exist in the country, and there are serious imbalance in certain pockets, which is a serious concern for the nation as well as for the society. Sex ratio also at birth has also led to something called a discussion on the missing girls in the country, because it is found that there are millions of girls missing due to the lower sex ratio of females to males, as well as other factors such as sex differentials in fertility, sex differentials in mortality, and sex differentials to some extent in migration. All these on average leads to what is called a considerable missing girls in the country as well as in many parts of the society. So, these missing girls in general are as a result, more importantly due to sex selective abortions and as well as unfavorable sex ratio at death, which happens in many contexts. In general, we would say that sex ratio at birth is expected to be normally biologically determined, and it should be favorable to males, but within the safe range of 103 to 108 males per 100 females, or within the range of 952 females for every 1000 males if we compute in terms of how Census of India computes. It is, however, it is found that the sex ratio at birth in many parts of the country is much lower than the normal or biologically determined sex ratio. It is often argued that it is because of the sex selective abortion which is widely prevalent in the country, because of the strong desire for a particular sex composition among the children for the couples. So, the desire for sons and the aversion towards daughters are highly prevalent in many parts of the country, which is leading to an unbalanced sex ratio at birth. We have already seen and studied that there are various demographic, social, economic and cultural factors play a role in this, and it has a wider implications both in terms of its demography, both in terms of its societal balance as well as its economic implications. So, sex ratio at birth has to be viewed widely in terms of its larger implications for the society, economy and culture, rather than it is considered just in terms of mere balance of the numbers. Thank you.